And welcome back to the fourth installment of the Nimzo-Indian series. Today, what we'll be looking at is lines where white plays the combative Leningrad variation and the Samish variation. So, what even are those? I might just be talking about random places or random people at the moment, but let's talk about what these actually are. So, let's begin with the Leningrad variation. That is, in our favorite Nimzo-Indian system, white plays this move, bishop to g5, kind of counterpinning the pin we've already established on this c3 knight. Now, why do I call this a combative response? The reason is white, is accelerating their queenside development and stopping us from gaining control on this e4 square with our knight by establishing their own pin on our queen. So, at this point, we really don't like this pin, so we play h6. After all, it is a tempo, and after we castle, we will have breathing room for a king later in the game, which is always a good thing. And after bishop h4, I do like continuing with c5 here. And the point is, we're not going to continue with something like g5, as we don't have our light squared bishop yet, so we don't have as much control of e4 as we would like. If we wanted to go aggressive with c5, or with g5 and f5 and knight e4. But I do like this move c5 because we are still attacking the center, but we can delay the movement of our d-pawn so that our king can get safe before this diagonal becomes weak. So after c5, most common move is in fact d5. This is very restricting, and that's why it's so appealing actually, because d5 you don't want to take because this allows our bishop to come back, and you might not also want to leave the tension because white wants to play e3 and bishop d3 and so on. So d5 might be an appealing choice for amateur players, but in this line I actually just like playing d6 here. And this is kind of similar to a structure you would find in the Benoni, where we have a pawn on d6, a pawn on c5, and this d6 pawn looks to be backwards. But it's actually very nice for white as we completely control the e5 square. There's no chance any one of white's pieces, whether it be the knight or the bishop, can come onto the e5 square. And if white just continues with e3, obviously if taking on e6, we are so happy to take with the bishop. We are looking to play d5 on the next move, and this is just very good for black. But if white continues with natural development, we can actually first take the knight, damage the structure, and then play this nice consolidating move e5. Now, this is by far not the most popular line. But the reason why I chose this is because I really don't want you to have to deal with this weakness on d6. Especially when the position is open. So the best move by far for black here, according to Stockfish, is to play this move e takes d5, which is kind of counterintuitive because you are undoubling white's pawns, you're opening up e4 and c4 later in the game, but I think it's definitely an option to consider. But for the sake of this series, I really like e5 here, because it gives white a plus 0.4 advantage, which is still literally equal. So nothing to worry about regarding evaluation-wise. But I like this position because you're locking it down, you're opening up your bishop so that it can come to f5. If white plays bishop d3 in this position, you actually just have e4, which looks strange, but after bishop takes e4, thinking, oh, well, I'm so smart with the pin, g5. And, well, that's kind of a cold shower for white, and they're just losing the bishop. So that's kind of a nice trap that white can fall in, but instead, white will most often play queen c2 here. And the point is, they're trying to meet this bishop d3 move and stop this e4 from happening by being able to control this with two pieces. So after queen e7 here, which strengthens this e4 move another time, we'll see knight f3, which is obviously supernatural move, trying to go to d2 and maybe even to e4. and just have general control over the middle with this knight. But actually, this knight is actually not very good unless you reroute it to d2 or to b3, and it's not that easy to even make it good because we control the middle so well with our pawns and our knights, and this h6 pawn to stop knight g5, that this knight is pretty much immobile if you think about it. So after something like knight d7, we are in a very reasonable position. Computer might say plus 0.8, for instance, but it's not even that practical for white to hold that kind of advantage, because after something like knight d2, we can just castle, even play e4 and knight e5, and this d3 square is up for grabs. This pawn is always weak with b6 and bishop a6, and we can start even breaking out later in the game if we want with king h8, rook g8, and g5. So this is a common attacking plan. And one thing I always like saying when you're trying to memorize opening theory is it's always good to memorize the plans as your first priority rather than just, memorizing the moves like mindlessly, essentially. Because when you're playing in an over-the-board game, if you really know why your moves are good, it really not only boosts your confidence during the game, but it also helps you address your opponent's threats better because you understand the purpose of your own moves and what weaknesses you're either creating or attacking. So that's just one remark about memorizing opening theory. But anyways, let's go to the next set of lines. So after the Leningrad variation, another variation that you will see a lot is, after this famous setup, a3. White just asks to your bishop, what are you doing here, right? The bishop shouldn't be on b4. I'll just play a3 and get it over with. So obviously, bishop takes c3. This is kind of the whole point. Pawn takes c3, and now I love this move c5. Now we can really see why c5 is such a good move after d takes c5. This is such a bad pawn structure for white. Knight a6 is a very common move, trying to get to the c5 pawn. So is queen a5 as well, after castles. And you are going to win one of these three pawns. I mean, it's kind of like you're spoiled for choice, honestly. Even with this knight coming to e4 and pressuring these two pawns, you will win one of them for sure. So d takes e5 is obviously bad for white. So white will continue with e3. Remember, don't get too greedy here and decide to, I like taking things, and don't take here. Because you're kind of just helping white after they play c takes d4. Now they have a perfectly okay center, bishop d3, knight f3, and I mean, now all of our efforts in the opening have kind of gone to waste. After all, we've given away a bishop for nothing at this point, because the compensation that we have relies on the fact that white's structure is damaged. So, after e3, we will just continue with knight c6, keeping in mind the plan that if takes, we just have queen a5. And so after knight c6, white will continue with bishop d3. And one thing you might be considering here is d5 for white, trying to attack this knight over here. But I actually just really like continuing with knight a5. And this is a common plan in the Nimzo-Indian anyways, so it's kind of as if white is helping you, because knight c6 and knight a5 is really common because you want to play b6, bishop a6, and round up the c4 pawn later. So, after bishop d3 here, I highly recommend just castling. Always good to get your king to safety. And after knight e2, b6. Very nice move, trying to put your bishop on b7 on this open diagonal where almost literally nothing can challenge it because your knight has such good control over the middle and especially these two squares. So after something like e4, which is very common, after all, we've tried controlling white center on this aspect of the board, but we haven't actually stopped white from playing e4. Why did we do this? Because we are actually completely okay with playing knight e8 here. And why do I advocate for knight e8 here? Because this knight is actually kind of blocking what we want to do. one of the ways that we combat this opening and this system is we're putting a bishop on this diagonal. Now, if white castles short and this position opens up a little bit more, this bishop will be a monster, attacking the king on this diagonal. By retreating the knight backwards, we're also opening up the queen. And after something like f5, we're completely attacking. And there's actually a very nice game in this line after castles, bishop a6, going for this pawn, f4, where white tries to attack the king, and now black can combat with f5. And super nice game between Hikaru and Magnus, where Hikaru had a very nice win with black, and especially against a player of Magnus's caliber, that's definitely a game to look at, especially from this kind of imbalanced position like this, where white seems to be controlling the entire center, but black fights on the flank and with their pieces in the center and on the king and queen sides respectively. So super sharp and dynamic position, ef5, ef5, always remember to take back with the pawn. Now you can bring back the knight to f6 if you want to, play d6, control this e5 square, guard your c5 pawn, and plant the knight in the center, and you'll be doing very well in this position. So those are kind of all the lines for the same-ish variation. There is actually one line after a3, bishop takes e3, b takes c3, c5, and e3. Instead of playing e3, white can kind of play f3 here, and this is one of the transpositions to the f3 lines, and we've kind of already seen this kind of system before with knight e7 and castles. So those are really all the main lines. I hope that helps, and I'll see you in the next and final episode of the Nimzo-Indian portion of the Slaying 1d4 course.